Mr. Midshipman Hornblower by C.S. Forester. Chapter 1. The Even Chance. A January gale was roaring up the channel, blustering loudly and bearing in its bosom rain squalls, whose big drops rattled loudly on the tarpaulin clothing of those among the officers and men whose duty had kept them on deck. So hard and so long had the gale blown that even in the sheltered waters of Spithead the battleship moved uneasy at her anchors, pitching a little in the choppy seas, and snubbing herself against the tautened cables with unexpected jerks. A shore boat was on its way out to her, propelled by oars in the hands of two sturdy women. It danced madly on the steep little waves, now and then putting its nose into one and sending a sheet of spray flying aft. The oarswoman in the bow knew her business, and with rapid glances over her shoulder not only kept the boat on its course, but turned the bows into the worst of the waves to keep from capsizing. It slowly drew up along the starboard side of the Justinian, and as it approached the main chains, the midshipman of the watch hailed it. "Aye, aye," came back the answering hail from the lusty lungs of the woman at the stroke oar. But the curious and ages-old convention of the Navy, the reply meant that the boat had an officer on board, presumably the huddled figure in the stern sheets, looking more like a heap of trash with a boat cloak thrown over it. That was as much as Mr. Masters, the lieutenant of the watch, could see. He was sheltering as best he could in the lee of the mizzenmast bitts, and in obedience to the order of the midshipman of the watch, the boat drew up towards the main chains and passed out of his sight. There was a long delay. Apparently the officer had some difficulty in getting up the ship's side. At last the boat reappeared in Master's field of vision. The women had shoved off and were setting a scrap of lug sail under which the boat, now without its passenger, went swooping back towards Portsmouth, leaping on the waves like a steeplechaser. As it departed, Mr. Masters became aware of the near approach of someone along the quarterdeck. It was the new arrival, under the escort of the midshipman of the watch, who, after pointing Masters out, retired to the main chains again. Mr. Masters had served in the Navy until his hair was white. In fact, he was lucky to have received his commission as lieutenant, and as he had long known that he would never receive one as captain. But the knowledge had not greatly embittered him, and he diverted his mind by the study of his fellow men. And it was with this that he looked with attention at the approaching figure. It was that of a skinny young man, only just leaving boyhood behind, something above middle height, with feet whose adolescent proportions to his size were accentuated by the thinness of his legs and his big half-boots. His gawkiness called attention to his hands and elbows. The newcomer was dressed in a badly fitting uniform, which was soaked right through by the spray. A skinny neck stuck out of the high stock, and above the neck was a white, bony face. A white face was a rarity on the deck of a ship of war, whose crew soon tanned to a deep mahogany. But this face was not merely white. In the hollow cheeks there was a faint shade of green. Clearly the newcomer had experienced seasickness in his passage out of the shore boat. Set in the white face were a pair of dark eyes, which by contrast looked like holes cut in a sheet of paper. Masters noticed with a slight stirring of interest that the eyes, despite their owner's seasickness, were looking about keenly, taking in what were obviously new sights. There was a curiosity and an interest there which could not be repressed, and which continued to function notwithstanding either seasickness or shyness, and Mr. Masters surmised in his far-fetched fashion that this boy had a vein of caution or foresight in his temperament, and was already studying his new surroundings with a view to being prepared for his next experience. So my Daniel might have looked about him with the lions when he first entered their den. The dark eyes met Masters, and the gawky figure came to a halt, raising his hand self-consciously to the brim of his dripping hat. His mouth opened and tried to say something, but closed again without achieving its object as shyness overcame him. But then the newcomer nerved himself afresh, and forced himself to say the formal words which he had been coached to utter. "Come aboard, sir." "Your name?" asked Masters, after waiting for it a moment. Horatio Hornblower, sir. Midshipman, stuttered the boy. Very good, Mr. Hornblower, said Masters, with the equally formal response. Did you bring a dunnage aboard with you? Hornblower had never heard that word before, but he still had enough of his wits about him to deduce what it meant. My sea chest, sir. It's forward, at the entry port. Hornblower said these things with the barest hesitation. He knew that at sea they said them, and that they pronounced the word forward like that, and that he had come aboard through the entry port. But it called for a slight effort to utter them himself. I'll see that it's sent below, said Masters. And that's where you'd better go too. The captain's ashore, and the first lieutenant's orders were that he's not to be called on any account before 8 bells. So I advise you, Mr. Hornblower, to get out of those wet clothes while you can. Yes, sir. His senses told him, the moment he said it, that he'd used an improper expression. The look on Masters' face told him as much, and he corrected himself, hardly believing that men really said these things off the boards of a stage before Masters had time to correct him. Aye, sir, said Hornblower, and as a second afterthought, he put his hand to the brim of his hat again. Masters returned the compliment, and turned to one of the shivering messengers cowering in the adequate shelter of the bulwark. Boy, take Mr. Hornblower down to the midshipman's berth. Aye, sir. Hornblower accompanied the boy forward to the main hatchway. Seasickness alone would have made him unsteady on his feet, but twice on the short journey he stumbled like a man tripping over a rope as a sharp gust brought the Justinian up against her cables with a jerk. At the hatchway, the boy slid down the ladder like an eel over a rock. Hornblower, meanwhile, had to brace himself and descend far more gingerly and uncertainly into the dim light of the lower gun deck, and then into the twilight of the 'tween decks. The smell that entered his nostrils were as strange and as assorted as the noises that assailed his ears. At the foot of each ladder, the boy waited for him with a patience whose tolerance was just obvious. After his last descent, a few steps, Hornblower had already lost his sense of direction, and did not know whether he was aft or forward. Took them to a gloomy recess whose shadows were accentuated rather than lightened by a tallow dip spiked onto a bit of copper plate on a round table on which were seated half a dozen shirt-sleeved men. The boy vanished, and left Hornblower standing there, and it was a second or two before the whiskered man at the head of the table looked up at him. Speak, thou apparition, said he. Hornblower felt a wave of nausea overcoming. The after-effects of his trip on the shore boat were being accentuated by the incredible stuffiness and smelliness of the 'tween decks. It was very hard to speak, and the fact that he did not know how to phrase what he wanted to say made it harder still. My name is Hornblower, he quavered at length. What an infernal piece of bad luck for you, said a second man at the table, with a complete absence of sympathy. At that moment, in the roaring world outside the ship, the wind veered sharply, heaving the Justinian a trifle and swinging around to snub at her cables again. To Hornblower, it seemed more as if the world had come loose from its fastenings. He reeled where he stood, and although he was shuddering with cold, he felt sweat upon his face. I suppose you have come, said the whiskered man at the head of the table, to thrust yourself among your betters. Another soft-headed ignoramus come to be a nuisance to those who have to try and teach you to your duties. Look at him. The speaker, with a gesture, demanded the attention of everyone at the table. Look at him, I say. The king's latest bad bargain. How old are you, boy? 17, sir. 17. The disgust in the speaker's voice was only too evident. You must start at 12 if you ever wish to be a seaman. 17! Do you know the difference between a head and a halyard? That drew a laugh from the group. The quality of the laugh was just noticeable to Hornblower's whirling brain, so that he guessed that whether he said yes or no, he would be equally exposed to ridicule. He groped for a neutral reply. That's the first thing I'll look up in Norrie seamanship, he said. The ship lurched again at that moment, and he clung to the table. Gentlemen, he began pathetically, wondering how to say what he had in mind. My God! Screamed somebody at the table. He's seasick! Seasick in Spithead, said somebody else, in a tone in which amazement had as much a place as disgust. But Hornblower had ceased to care. He was not really conscious of what was going on around him, for some time after that. The nervous excitement of the last few days was as much to blame, perhaps, as the journey in the shore boat and the erratic behaviour of the Justinian at her anchors. But it meant for him that he was labelled at once as the midshipman who was sick in Spithead, and it was only natural that the label added to the natural misery of the loneliness and homesickness which oppressed him during those days when that part of the Channel Fleet, which had not succeeded in completing its cruise, lay at anchor at the lee in the Isle of Wight. An hour in the hammock into which the messman hoisted him enabled him to recover sufficiently to be able to report himself to the first lieutenant. After a few days on board, he was able to find his way around the ship without, as happened at first, losing his sense of direction below decks, so that he did not know whether he was facing forward or facing aft. During that period, his brother officers ceased to have faces, which were mere blurs, and came to take on personalities instead. He came painfully to learn the stations allotted him when the ship was at quarters, and when he was on watch, and when hands were summoned for setting or taking in sail. He even came to have an acute enough understanding of his new life to realize that it could have been much worse. That destiny might have instead put him on board a ship ordered immediately to sea, instead of one lying at anchor. But it was a poor enough compensation. He was a lonely and unhappy boy. Shyness alone would have long delayed his making friends, but as it happened, the midshipman's berth in the Justinian was occupied by men all a good deal older than he. Elderly master's mates recruited from the merchant service, a midshipman in their 20s who, through lack of patronage or inability to pass the necessary examination, had never succeeded in gaining for themselves commissions as lieutenants. They were inclined, after the first moments of amused interest, to ignore him, and he was glad of that, delighted to shrink into his shell and attract no more notice to himself. For the Justinian was not a happy ship during those gloomy January days. Captain Keane, it was when he came aboard first that Hornblower saw the pomp and ceremony that surrounds the captain of a ship of the line, was a sick man, of a melancholy disposition. He had not the fame which enabled some captains to fill their ships with enthusiastic volunteers, and he was devoid of the personality which might have made enthusiasts out of the sullen, pressed men whom the press gangs were bringing in from day to day to complete the ship's complement. His officers saw little of him, and did not love what they saw. Hornblower, summoned to his cabin for his first interview, was not impressed. A middle-aged man at a table covered with papers, with the hollow and yellow cheeks of prolonged illness. "Mr. Hornblower," he said formally, "I am glad to have the opportunity of welcoming you aboard my ship." "Yes, sir." That seemed a more appropriate to the occasion than "Aye, aye, sir," and a junior midshipman seemed to be expected to say one or the other on all occasions. "You are, let me see, 17? Captain Keane picked up the paper, which apparently covered Hornblower's brief official career. "Yes, sir." "July 4th, 1776, mused Keane, reading Hornblower's date of birth to himself. 5 years to the day before I was posted as captain. I'd been 6 years a lieutenant before you were born." "Yes, sir," agreed Hornblower. It did not seem to be the occasion for any further comment. "A doctor's son. You should have chosen a lord for your father if you wanted to make a career for yourself." "Yes, sir." "How far did your education go?" "I was a Grecian at school, sir." "So you can construe Xenophon as well as Cicero?" "Yes, sir, but not very well." "Better if you knew something about sines and cosines. Better if you could foresee a squall in time to get the togallants in. We have no use for ablative absolutes in the Navy." "Yes, sir." He'd only just learned what a togallant was, but he could have told his captain that his mathematical studies were far advanced. He refrained, nevertheless. His instincts, combined with his recent experiences, urged him not to volunteer unsolicited information. "Well, obey your orders, learn your duties, and no harm shall come to you. That will do." "Thank you, sir," said Hornblower, retiring. But the captain's last words to him seemed to be contradicted immediately. Harm began to come to Hornblower from that day forth, despite his obedience to orders and diligent study of his duties, and it stemmed from the arrival in the midshipman's berth of one John Simpson as senior warrant officer. Hornblower was sitting at the mess with his colleagues when he saw him, a brawny, good-looking man in his 30s, who came in and stood before them just as Hornblower had stood a few days before. "Hello," said somebody, not very cordially. "Cleveland, my bold friend," said the newcomer. "Come out from that seat. I'm going to resume my place at the head of the table." "But come out, I said," snapped Simpson. Cleveland moved along with some show of reluctance, and Simpson took his place, glowered round at the table in reply to the curious glances with which everyone regarded him. "Yes, my sweet brother officers," he said. "I am back in the bosom of the family, and I am not surprised that nobody is pleased. You will all be less pleased by the time I'm done with you, I may add." "But your commission?" asked somebody, greatly daring. "My commission?" Simpson leaned forward and tapped on the table, staring down at the inquisitive people on either side of it. "I'll answer that question this once, and the man who asks again will wish he'd never been born. A board of turnip-headed captains has refused me my commission. It decided that my mathematical knowledge was insufficient as to make me a reliable navigator. And so, Acting Lieutenant Simpson is once again Mr. Midshipman Simpson at your service. At your service. And may the Lord have mercy on your souls." It did not seem, as the days went by, that the Lord had any mercy at all, for with Simpson's return, life in the midshipman's berth ceased to be one of passive unhappiness, and instead became one of active misery. Simpson had apparently always been an ingenious tyrant, but now, embittered and humiliated by his failure to pass his examination for his commission, he was a worse tyrant, and his ingenuity had multiplied itself. He may have been weak in mathematics, but he was diabolically clever at making other people's lives a burden to them. As senior officer in the mess, he had wide official powers. As a man with a blistering tongue and a morbid sense of mischief, he would have been powerful anyway, even if the Justinian had possessed an alert and masterful first lieutenant to keep him in check, while Mr. Clay was neither. Twice Midshipman rebelled against Simpson's arbitrary authority, and each time Simpson thrashed the rebel, pounding him into insensibility with his huge fists, for Simpson would have made a successful prize fighter. Each time Simpson was left unmarked. Each time his opponent's blackened eyes and swollen lips called down the penalty of mastheading, an extra duty from the indignant first lieutenant. The mess seethed with impotent rage. Even the toadies and the lickspittles among the midshipmen, and naturally there were several, hated the tyrant. Significantly, it was not his ordinary extractions which roused the greatest resentment. His levying toll upon their sea chests for clean shirts for himself, his appropriation of the best cuts of meat served, nor even his taking their coveted issue of spirits. These things could be excused as understandable, the sort of thing they themselves would do had they had the power. But he displayed a whimsical arbitrariness which reminded Hornblower, with his classical education, of the freaks of the Roman emperors. He forced Cleveland to shave his whiskers, which were his inordinate pride. He imposed upon Heather the duty of waking up Mackenzie every half an hour, day and night, so that neither of them were able to sleep, and there were his toadies ready to tell him if Heather ever failed in his task. Early enough he had discovered Hornblower's most vulnerable points, as he had with everybody else. He knew of Hornblower's shyness. At first it was amusing to compel Hornblower to recite verses from Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard to the assembled mess. The toadies could compel Hornblower to do it. Simpson, meanwhile, would lay his dirk scabbard upon the table in front of him with a significant glance, and the toadies would close around Hornblower, who knew that any hesitation on his part would mean that he'd be stretched across the table and the dirk scabbard applied. The flat of the scabbard was painful, and the edge of it was agonizing, but the pain was nothing to the utter humiliation of it all. And the torment grew worse when Simpson instituted what he aptly called the proceedings of the Inquisition, when Hornblower was submitted to a slow and methodical questioning regarding his home life and his boyhood. Every question was to be answered on pain of the dirk scabbard, and Hornblower could fence and prevaricate, but he had to answer, and sooner or later the relentless questioning would draw from him some simple admission which would rouse a peal of laughter from his audience. Heaven knows that in Hornblower's lonely childhood there was nothing to be ashamed of, but boys are odd creatures, particularly the reticent ones, like Hornblower, and are ashamed of things no one else would think twice about. The ordeal would leave him weak and sick, and someone less solemn might have clowned his way out of his difficulties, and even into popular favour. But Hornblower, at 17, was too ponderous a person to clown. He had to endure the persecution, experiencing all the black misery which only a 17-year-old can experience. He never wept in public, but at night more than once he'd shed the bitter tears of 17. He often thought about death. He often even thought about desertion, but realized that desertion would lead to something worse than death, and then his mind would revert to death, savouring the thought of suicide. He came to long for death, friendless as he was, and brutally ill-treated, and lonely as only a boy among men, and a very reserved boy can be. More and more he thought about ending it all the easiest way, hugging the secret thought of it to his friendless bosom. If the ship had only been at sea, everybody would have been kept busy enough to be kept out of mischief. Even at anchor, an energetic captain and first lieutenant would have kept all hands hard enough at work to obviate the abuses. But it was Hornblower's hard luck that the Justinian lay at anchor all throughout that fatal January of 1794 under a sick captain and an inefficient first lieutenant. Even the activities which were at times enforced often worked to Hornblower's disadvantage. There was an occasion when Mr. Bowles, the master, was holding a class in navigation for his mates and for the midshipmen, and the captain, by bad luck, happened by and glanced through the results of the problem his class had individually been set to solve. His illness made Keane a man of bitter tongue, and he cherished no liking for Simpson. He took a single glance at Simpson's paper and chuckled sarcastically. "Now let us all rejoice," he said. "The sources of the Nile have been discovered at last." "Pardon, sir?" "Your ship," said Keane. "As far as I can make out from your illiterate scroll, Mr. Simpson, it's in Central Africa. Now let us see what other terras incognitae have been opened up by the remaining intrepid explorers of this class." It must have been fate. It was dramatic enough to be art and not an occurrence in real life. Hornblower knew what was going to happen even as Keane picked up the other papers, including his. The result he had obtained was the only one which was correct. Everybody else had added the correction for a fraction instead of subtracting it, or had worked out the multiplication wrongly, or had, like Simpson, botched the whole problem altogether. "Congratulations, Mr. Hornblower," said Keane. "You must be proud to be alone successful amongst this crowd of intellectual giants. You are half Mr. Simpson's age, I fancy. If you double your attainments while you double your years, you will leave the rest of us far behind. Mr. Bowles, you'll be so good as to see that Mr. Simpson pays even further attention to his mathematical studies." And with that he went off along the 'tween decks, with the halting step resulting from his mortal disease, and Hornblower sat with his eyes cast down, unable to meet the glances he knew were being darted at him, and knowing full well what they portended. He longed for death at that moment. In fact, he even prayed for it at night. Within 2 days, Hornblower found himself ashore, and under Simpson's command. The 2 midshipmen were in charge of a party of seamen, landed to act along with parties from the other ships of the squadron as a press gang. The West India convoy was due to arrive soon. Most of the hands would be pressed as soon as the convoy reached the channel, and the remainder, left to work the ships to an anchorage, would sneak ashore, using every device to conceal themselves and find a safe hiding place. It was the business of the landing parties to cut off this retreat, to lay a cordon along the waterfront which would sweep them all up, but the convoy was not yet signalled, and all arrangements were completed. "All is well with the world," said Simpson. It was an unusual speech for him, but he was in unusual circumstances. He was sitting in the back room of the Lamb Inn, comfortable in one armchair with his legs on another, in front of a roaring fire and with a pot of beer with gin in it at his elbow. "Here's to the West India convoy," said Simpson, taking a pull at his beer. "Long may it be delayed." Simpson was actually genial. Activity and beer and a warm fire thawing him into a good humour. It was not time yet for the liquor to make him quarrelsome. Hornblower sat on the other side of the fire and sipped beer without gin in it, and studied him, marvelling that for the first time since he had boarded the Justinian, his unhappiness should have ceased to be active, but should have subsided into a dull misery like the dying away of the pain in an aching tooth. "Give us a toast there, boy," said Simpson. "Confusion to Robespierre," said Hornblower lamely. The door opened and two more officers came in, one a midshipman, while the other wore the single epaulet of a lieutenant. It was Chalk of the Goliath, the officer in general charge of the press gang sent ashore. Even Simpson made room for his superior rank before the fire. "The convoy still not signalled," announced Chalk, and then he eyed Hornblower keenly. "I don't think I have the pleasure of your acquaintance. Mr. Hornblower, Lieutenant Chalk," introduced Simpson. "Mr. Hornblower is distinguished as the midshipman who was sick in Spithead." Hornblower tried not to writhe as Simpson tied that label to him. He imagined that Chalk was merely being polite when he changed the subject. "Hey, potman! Will you gentlemen join me in a glass? We have a long wait before us, I fear." "Your men are properly posted, Mr. Simpson?" "Yes, sir." Chalk was an active man. He paced about the room, stared out the window at the rain, presented his midshipman, Mr. Caldwell, to the other two when the drinks arrived, and obviously fretted at his enforced inactivity. "A game of cards to pass the time," he suggested. "Excellent! Hey, potman! Cards on a table and another light, please." The table was set before the fire, the chairs arranged, and the cards brought in. "Now what game shall it be?" asked Chalk, looking round. He was a lieutenant among three midshipmen, and any suggestion of his was likely to carry a good deal of weight. The other three naturally waited to hear what he had to say. "21? That is a game. No, that is a game for the half-witted. Lou? That is the game for the wealthier half-witted. But whist now? Aye, that would give us all scope for the exercise of our poor talents. Caldwell there is acquainted with the rudiments of the game, I know. Mr. Simpson." A man like Simpson, with a mathematical blind spot, was not likely to be a good whist player, but he was not likely to know he was a bad one. "As you wish, sir," said Simpson. He enjoyed gambling, and one game was as good as another for that purpose to his mind. "Mr. Hornblower?" "With pleasure, sir." That was more nearly true than most conventional replies. Hornblower had learned his whist in a good school. Ever since the death of his mother, he had made a fourth with his father and the parson and the parson's wife. The game was already something of a passion with him. He revelled in the nice calculation of chances, in the varying demands it made upon his boldness or caution. There was even enough warmth in his acceptance to attract a second glance from Chalk, who, a good card player himself, at once detected a fellow spirit. "Excellent," he said. "Then we may as well cut at once for places and partners. What should be the stakes, gentlemen? A shilling and a trick and a guinea on the rubbers, or is that too great? No? No. Wonderful. Then we're agreed." For some time the game proceeded quietly. Hornblower cut first Simpson and then Caldwell as his partner. Only a couple of hands were necessary to show up Simpson as a hopeless whist player, the kind who would always lead an ace when he had one, or a singleton when he had four trumps. But he and Hornblower won the first rubber thanks to overwhelming card strength. But Simpson lost in the next partnership with Chalk. Cut Chalk again as partner, and lost again. He gloated over good hands and sighed over poor ones. Clearly he was one of those unenlightened people who looked upon whist as a social function, or as a mere crude means, like throwing dice, of arbitrarily transferring money. He never thought of the game either as a sacred rite or as an intellectual exercise. Moreover, as his losses grew, and the potman came and went with liquor, he grew restless, and his face was flushed with more than the heat of the fire. He was both a bad loser and a bad drinker, and even Chalk's punctilious good manners were sufficiently strained so that he displayed a hint of relief when the next cut gave him Hornblower as a partner. They won the rubber easily, and another guinea and several shillings were transferred to Hornblower's lean purse. He was now the only winner, and Simpson was the heaviest loser. Hornblower was lost in the pleasure of playing the game again. The only attention he paid to Simpson's writhings and muttering objurgations was to regard them as distracting nuisance. He had even forgot to think of them as danger signals. Momentarily he was oblivious to the fact that he might pay for his present success by future torment. Once more they cut, and he found himself Chalk's partner again. 2 good hands gave him the first game. Then twice, to Simpson's unconcealed triumph, Simpson and Caldwell made a small score, approaching game, and in the next hand, an overbold finesse by Hornblower left him and Chalk with the odd trick when their score should have been 2 tricks greater. Simpson laid his knave on Hornblower's 10 with a grin of delight, which turned to dismay when he found that he and Caldwell had still only made 6 tricks. He counted them a second time with annoyance. Hornblower dealt and turned the trump, and Simpson led, an ace as usual, assuring Hornblower of his re-entry. He had a string of trumps and a good suit of clubs, which a single lead might establish. Simpson glanced, muttering at his hand. It was extraordinary that he had not realized the simple truth that the lead of an ace involved leading a second time with the problem no clearer. He made up his mind at last and led again. Hornblower's king took the trick, and he instantly led his knave of trumps. And to his delight, it took the trick. He led again, and Chalk's queen gave them another trick. Chalk laid down the ace of trumps, and Simpson, with a curse, played the king. Chalk led clubs of which Hornblower had 5 to the king-queen. It was significant that Chalk should lead them, as it could not be a singleton lead when Hornblower held the remaining trumps. Hornblower's queen took the trick, and Caldwell must hold the ace, unless Chalk did. Hornblower led a small one. Everyone followed suit. Chalk playing the knave, and Caldwell played the ace. 8 clubs had been played, and Hornblower had 3 more headed by the king, and 10, 3 certain tricks, with the last trumps as re-entries. Caldwell played the queen of diamonds. Hornblower played his singleton, and Chalk produced the ace. "The rest are mine," said Hornblower, laying down his cards. "What do you mean?" said Simpson, with the king of diamonds in his hands. 5 tricks, said Chalk briskly. "Game and rubber." "But don't I take another?" persisted Simpson. I trump a lead of diamonds or hearts and make 3 more clubs," explained Hornblower. To him, the situation was as simple as 2 and 2. A most ordinary finish to a hand. It was hard for him to realize that foggy-minded players like Simpson could find difficulty in keeping tally of 52 cards. Simpson flung down his hand. "You know too much about this game," he said. "You know the backs of the cards as well as the fronts." Hornblower gulped. He recognized that this could be a decisive moment if he so chose. A second before, he had merely been playing cards and enjoying himself. Now he was faced with an issue of life or death. A torrent of thoughts streamed through his mind. Despite the comfort of his present surroundings, he remembered acutely the hideous misery of life in the Justinian, to which he must return. This was an opportunity to end that misery, one way or the other. He remembered how he had contemplated killing himself, and into the back of his mind stole a germ of the plan upon which he was going to act. His decision crystallized. "That is an insulting remark, Mr. Simpson," he said. He looked round and met the eyes of Chalk and Caldwell, who were suddenly grave. Simpson was still merely stupid, and for that I shall have to ask satisfaction. "Satisfaction?" said Chalk hastily. Come, Mr. Simpson had a momentary loss of temper. I'm sure he will explain." "I have been accused of cheating at cards, sir," said Hornblower. "That is a hard thing to explain away." He was trying to behave more like a grown man. More than that, he was trying to act like a man consumed with indignation, while actually there was no indignation within him over the point in dispute, for he understood too well the muddled state of mind which had led Simpson to say what he did. But the opportunity had presented itself. He had determined to avail himself of it, and now what he had to do was play the part convincingly of the man who had received a mortal insult. "Come now, Mr. Hornblower, the wine was in and the wit was out," said Chalk, still determined on keeping the peace. "Mr. Simpson was speaking in jest, I'm sure. Let's call for another bottle and drink it in friendship." "With pleasure, sir," said Hornblower, fumbling for the words which would set the dispute beyond reconciliation. "If Mr. Simpson will beg my pardon at once, before you 2 gentlemen, and admit that he spoke without justification and in a manner that no gentleman would employ." He turned and met Simpson's eye with defiance as he spoke, metaphorically waving a red flag before a bull, who charged with gratifying fury. "Apologize to you, you little whippersnapper," exploded Simpson, alcohol and outraged dignity speaking simultaneously. "Never this side of hell." "You hear that, gentlemen?" said Mr. Hornblower. "I have been insulted, and Mr. Simpson refuses to apologize while insulting me further. There is only one way now in which satisfaction may be given. For the next 2 days, until the West India convoy came in, Hornblower and Simpson, under Chalk's orders, lived the curious life of two duelists forced into each other's society before the affair of honour. Hornblower was careful, as he would have been in any case, to obey every order given him, and Simpson gave them with a certain amount of self-conscious and awkwardness. It was during those 2 days that Hornblower elaborated on his original idea. Pacing through the dockyards with his patrol of seamen at his heels, he had plenty of time to think the matter over. Viewed coldly, and a boy of 17 in a mood of black despair can be objective enough on occasion, it was as simple as the calculations of the chances in a problem it wished. Nothing could be worse than his life on the Justinian, not even, as he thought already, death itself. Here was an easy death open to him, with the additional attraction that there was a chance of Simpson dying instead. It was at that moment that Hornblower advanced his idea one step further. A new development, startling even to him, bringing him to a halt so that the patrol behind him bumped into him before they could stop. "Beg your pardon, sir." No matter," said Hornblower, deep in his thoughts. He first brought forward his suggestion in conversation with Preston and Danvers, the 2 master's mates who asked to be second as soon as he returned to the Justinian. "We'll act for you, of course," said Preston, looking dubiously at the weedy youth when he made his request. "How do you want to fight him? As the aggrieved party, you have the choice of weapons." "Well, I've been thinking about it ever since he insulted me," said Hornblower, temporizing. It was not easy to come out with his idea in bald words, after all. "Have you any skill with the small sword?" asked Danvers. "No," said Hornblower. Truth to tell, he'd never even handled one. "Then it'd better be pistols," said Preston. "Simpson's is probably a good shot, though," said Danvers. "I wouldn't care to stand myself up before him." "Easy now, don't dishearten the lad," said Preston hastily. "I'm not disheartened, I was actually thinking the same as you," replied Hornblower. "You're cool enough about it, then," marvelled Danvers. Hornblower shrugged. "Maybe I am. I hardly care, but I've thought that we might make the chances even more even." "How?" "We could make them exactly even," said Hornblower, taking the plunge. "Have 2 pistols, one loaded and the other empty. Simpson and I would take our choice without knowing which was which. Then we would stand within a yard of each other, and then at the word, we fire." "My God!" said Danvers. "I don't think that would be legal," said Preston. "It would mean one of you would be killed for certain." "Killing is the object of duelling," said Hornblower. "If the conditions aren't unfair, I don't think any objection could be raised." "But would you carry it out to the end?" marvelled Danvers. "Mr. Danvers," began Hornblower, but Preston interfered. "We don't want another duel on our hands," he said. "Danvers only meant he wouldn't care to do it himself. We'll discuss it with Cleveland and Heather and see what they say." Within an hour, the proposed conditions of the duel were known to everybody aboard the ship. Perhaps it was to Simpson's disadvantage that he had no real friends in the ship, for Cleveland and Heather, his seconds, were not disposed to take too firm a stand against agreeing to the conditions. And they did agree with only a show of reluctance. The tyrant of the midshipman's berth was paying the penalty for his tyranny. There was some cynical amusement shown by some of the officers. Some of both officers and men warned Hornblower and Simpson with the curiosity that the prospect of death excites in some minds, as if the 2 destined opponents were men condemned to the gallows. At noon, Lieutenant Masters sent for Hornblower. "The captain has ordered me to make an inquiry into this duel, Mr. Hornblower. I am instructed to use my best endeavours to compose the quarrel." "Yes, sir." "Why insist on this satisfaction, Mr. Hornblower? I understand there were a few hasty words over wine and cards." "Mr. Simpson accused me of cheating, sir, before witnesses who are not officers of this ship. That was the point. The witnesses were not members of the ship's company. If Hornblower had chosen to disregard Simpson's words as the ramblings of a drunken, ill-tempered man, they might have passed unnoticed. But as he had taken the stand he did, there could be no hushing it up now, and Hornblower knew it. Well, even so, there can be satisfaction without a duel, Mr. Hornblower." If Mr. Simpson would make me a full apology before the same gentleman, I would be satisfied, sir. Simpson was no coward. He would rather die than submit but to such a formal humiliation. I see. Now I understand you were insisting on rather unusual conditions for the duel. There are precedents for it, sir. As the insulted party, I can choose any conditions which are not unfair. You sound like a sea lawyer to me, Mr. Hornblower. The hint was sufficient to tell Hornblower that he had verged upon being too glib, and he resolved in the future to bridle his tongue. He stood silent and waited for Masters to resume the conversation. You are determined, then, Mr. Hornblower, to continue with this murderous business? Yes, sir. Well, the captain has given me further orders to attend this duel in person because of the strange conditions on which you insist. I must inform you that I shall request the seconds to arrange for that. Yes, sir. Very good, then, Mr. Hornblower. Masters looked at Hornblower as he dismissed him even more keenly than he had done when Hornblower first came on board. He was looking for signs of weakness or wavering. Indeed, he was looking for any signs of human feeling at all, but he could detect none. Hornblower had reached a decision. He had weighed all the pros and cons, and his logical mind told him that having decided in cold blood upon a course of action, it would be folly now to allow himself to be influenced subsequently by untrustworthy emotions. The conditions of the duel on which he was insisting were mathematically advantageous. If he had once considered with favour escaping from Simpson's persecution by a voluntary death, it was surely a gain to take an even chance on escaping it without dying. Similarly, if Simpson were, as he almost certainly was, a better swordsman and a better shot than him, the even chance was again mathematically advantageous. There was nothing to regret about his recent actions. All very well. Mathematically, the conclusions were irrefutable. But Hornblower was surprised to find that mathematics was not everything. Repeatedly, during that dreary afternoon and evening, Hornblower found himself suddenly gulping with anxiety as the realization came to him afresh that tomorrow morning he would be risking his life on the spin of a coin. One chance out of two, and he would be dead. His consciousness at an end, his flesh cold, and the world, almost unbelievably, would be going on without him. The thought sent a shiver through him despite himself, and he had plenty of time for these reflections, for the convention that forbade him from encountering his destined opponent moments before the moment of the duel kept him necessarily in isolation, as far as isolation could be found on the crowded decks of the Justinian. He slung his hammock that night in a depressed mood, feeling unnaturally tired, and he undressed in the clammy, stuffy dampiness of the 'tween decks, feeling more than usually cold. He hugged the blankets round himself, yearning to relax in their warmth, but relaxation would not come. Time and time, as he began to drift off to sleep, he woke again tense and anxious, full of thoughts of the morrow. He turned over wearily a dozen times, hearing the ship's bell ring out each half hour, feeling a growing contempt at his cowardice. He told himself in the end that it was as well that his fate tomorrow depended upon pure chance, for if he had to rely upon the steadiness of hand and eye, he'd be dead for certain after a night like this. That conclusion presumably helped him to go to sleep for the last hour or two of the night, for he awoke with a start to find Danvers shaking him. 5 bells, said Danvers. Dawn in an hour. Rise and shine. Hornblower slid out of his hammock and stood in his shirt. The 'tween decks was nearly dark, and Danvers was almost invisible. Number 1's letting us have the second cutter, said Danvers. Masters and Simpson and that lot are going first in the launch. Here's Preston. Another shadowy figure loomed up in the darkness. Hellish cold, said Preston. Divil of a morning to turn out. Nelson, where's that tea? The mess attendant came in with it, as Hornblower was hauling on his trousers. It maddened Hornblower that he shivered enough in the cold for the cup to clatter in his saucer as he took it. But the tea was grateful, and Hornblower drank it eagerly. Give me another cup, he said, and was proud of himself that he could think about tea at that moment. It was still dark as they went into the cutter. Shove off, said the coxswain, and the boat pushed off from the ship's side. There was a keen cold wind blowing which filled the dipping lug as the cutter headed it for the twin lights that marked the jetty. I ordered a hackney coach at the George to be waiting for us, said Danvers. Let's hope it is. It was there. with the driver sufficiently sober to control his horse moderately well, despite his overnight potations. Danvers produced a pocket flask as they settled themselves in with their feet in the straw. "Take a sip, Hornblower?" he asked, proffering it. "There's no special need for a steady hand this morning." "No, thank you," said Hornblower. His empty stomach revolted at the idea of pouring spirits into it. "The others will be there before us," commented Preston. "I saw the quarter-boat heading back just before we reached the jetty." The etiquette of the duel demanded that the two opponents should reach the ground separately, but only one boat would be necessary for the return. "The Sawbones is with them," said Danvers, "though God knows what he thinks he'll be doing today." He sniggered, and with overlay politeness tried to cut his snigger off short. "How are you feeling, Hornblower?" asked Preston. "Well enough," said Hornblower, forbearing to add that he only felt well enough while this kind of conversation was not being carried on. The hackney coach levelled itself off as it came over the crest of the hill and stopped beside the common. Another coach stood there waiting, its single candle lamp burning yellow in the growing dawn. "There they are," said Preston. The faint light revealed a shadowy group standing on the frosty turf among the gorse bushes. Hornblower, as they approached, caught a glimpse of Simpson's face as he stood a little detached from the others. It was pale, and Hornblower noticed that at that moment he swallowed nervously, just as himself was doing. Masters came towards them, shooting his usual keen, inquisitive look at Hornblower as they came together. "This is the moment," he said, "for this quarrel to be composed. This country is at war. I hope, Mr. Hornblower, that you can be persuaded to save a life for the King's service by not pressing this matter." Hornblower looked across at Simpson, while Danvers answered for him. "Has Mr. Simpson offered the proper address?" asked Danvers. "Mr. Simpson is willing to acknowledge that he wishes that incident had never taken place." "Well, that is unsatisfactory form," said Danvers. "It does not include an apology, and you must agree that an apology is necessary, sir." "What does your principal say?" persisted Masters. "It is not for any principal to speak in these circumstances," said Danvers, with a glance at Hornblower, who nodded. All of this was as inevitable as the ride in the hangman's cart, and just as hideous. There could be no going back now. Hornblower had never thought for one moment that Simpson would apologise, and without an apology the affair must be carried to a bloody conclusion. An even chance that he did not have 5 minutes longer to live. "You were determined then, gentlemen," said Masters. "I shall have to state that fact in my report." "We are determined," said Preston. "And there is nothing for it but to allow this deplorable affair to proceed. I left the pistols in the charge of Dr. Hepplewhite." He turned and led them towards the other group, Simpson, with Heather and Cleveland, and Dr. Hepplewhite, standing with a pistol held by the muzzle in each hand. He was a bulky man, with the red face of a persistent drinker. He was actually grinning, a spirituous grin at that moment, rocking a little on his feet. "Are you the young fools set in their folly?" he asked. But everyone very properly ignored him as having no business now to ask such a question at such a moment. "Now," said Masters, "here are the pistols, both primed as you see, but one loaded and the other unloaded in accordance with the conditions. I have here a guinea which I propose to spin to determine the allocation of your weapons. Now, gentlemen, shall the spin give your principals one pistol each irrevocably? For instance, if the coin shows heads, shall Mr. Simpson have this one, or shall the winner of the spin have choice of the weapons? It is my design to eliminate all possibility of collusion as possible." Heather and Cleveland and Danvers and Preston exchanged dubious glances. "Let the winner of the spin choose," said Preston at length. "Very well, gentlemen. Please call Mr. Hornblower." "Tails," said Hornblower, as the gold piece spun in the air. Masters caught it and clapped a hand over it. "Tails it is," said Masters, lifting his hand and revealing the coin to the group seconds. "Please make your choice." Hepplewhite held out the two pistols to him, death in one hand and life in the other. It was a grim moment. There was only pure chance to direct him, and it called for little effort to force his hand out. "I'll have this one," he said, as he touched it. The weapon seemed icy cold. "Then now I've done what is required of me," said Masters. "The rest is for you gentlemen to carry out." "Take this one, Simpson," said Hepplewhite. "Be careful how you handle yours, Mr. Hornblower. You're a public danger." The man was still grinning, gloating over the fact that someone else was in mortal danger, while he himself was in none. Simpson took the pistol Hepplewhite offered him, and settled it to his hand. Once more his eyes met Hornblower's, but there was neither recognition nor expression in them. "There are no distances to step out," Danvers was saying. "One spot's as good as another. It's level enough here anyway." "Very good," said Heather. "Will you stand here, Mr. Simpson?" Preston beckoned to Hornblower, who walked over. It was not easy to appear brisk and unconcerned. Preston took him by the arm and stood him up in front of Simpson, almost breast to breast, close enough to smell the alcohol on his breath. "For the last time, gentlemen," said Masters loudly, "can you not be reconciled?" There was no answer from anybody. Only deep silence, during which seemed to Hornblower that the frantic breathing of his beating heart must be clearly audible. The silence was broken by an exclamation from Heather. "We haven't settled who's to give the word." "Who's going to?" "Let's ask Mr. Masters to give it," said Danvers. Hornblower did not look around. He was looking steadfastly at the grey sky past Simpson's right ear. Somehow he could not look him in the face, and he had no idea where Simpson was looking. The end of the world as he knew it was close to him. Soon there might be a bullet through his heart. "I will do it if you are agreed, gentlemen," he heard Masters say. The grey sky was featureless. For this last look on the world, he might as well have been blindfolded. Masters raised his voice once more. "I will say 1, 2, 3, fire," he announced. "With those intervals, at the last word, gentlemen, you may fire as you will. Are you ready?" "Yes," came Simpson's voice, almost in Hornblower's ear, it seemed. "Yes," said Hornblower. You could hear the strain in his own voice. "1," said Masters, and Hornblower felt at that moment the muzzle of Simpson's pistol against his left ribs, and he raised his own. It was in that second that he decided. He could not kill Simpson, even if it were within his power, and he went on lifting his pistol, forcing himself to see that it was pressed against the point of Simpson's shoulder. A slight wound would suffice. 2, said Masters. 3. Fire! Hornblower pulled his trigger. There was a click and a spurt of smoke from the lock of the pistol. The priming had gone off, but no more. His was the unloaded weapon, and he knew what it was to die. A tenth of a second later, there was a click and a spurt of smoke from Simpson's pistol against his heart. Stiff and still, they both stood, slow to realize what had just happened. "A misfire, by God!" said Danvers. The seconds crowded round them. "Give me those pistols," said Masters, taking them from the weak hands that held them. "The loaded one might be hanging fire, and we don't want it to go off now." "Which one was the loaded one?" asked Heather, consumed with curiosity. "That is something better not to know," answered Masters, changing the two pistols rapidly from hand to hand so as to confuse everybody. "What about a second shot?" asked Danvers, and Masters looked up straight and inflexibly at him. "There will be no second shot," he said. "Honour is completely satisfied. These two gentlemen have come through this ordeal incredibly well. No one can now think little of Mr. Simpson if he expresses regret for the occurrence, and no one can think little of Mr. Hornblower if he accepts that statement in reparation." Hepplewhite burst into a roar of laughter. "Your faces!" he boomed, slapping his thigh. "You ought to see how you all look, solemn as cows." "Mr. Hepplewhite," said Masters, "your behaviour is indecorous. Gentlemen, our coaches are waiting on the road and the cutter is at the jetty. I think all of us would be the better for some breakfast, including Mr. Hepplewhite." Now that should have been the end of the incident. The excited talk which had gone round the anchored squadron about the unusual duel died away in time, although everyone now knew Hornblower's name, and not as the midshipman who was seasick in Spithead, but as the man who was willing to take an even chance in cold blood. But in the Justinian herself there was other talk, whispers which were circulated forward and aft. "Mr. Hornblower has requested permission to speak to you, sir," said Mr. Clay, the first lieutenant, one morning while making his report to the captain. "Oh, send him in when you go out," said Keane, and sighed. 10 minutes later, a knock on the cabin door ushered in a very angry young man. "Sir," began Hornblower, "I can guess what you're going to say. Those pistols in the duel I fought with Simpson were not loaded. Hepplewhite blabbed, I suppose. And it was by your orders, I understand, sir. You are quite correct. I gave those orders to Mr. Masters. It was an unwarrantable liberty, sir. That was what Hornblower had meant to say, but he stumbled without dignity over the polysyllables. Possibly it was, said Keane, patiently rearranging, as always, the papers on his desk. The calmness of the admission disconcerted Hornblower, who could only splutter for the next few moments. I saved a life for the king's service, went on Keane when the spluttering died away. A young life. No one has suffered any harm. On the other hand, both of you and Simpson have had your courage amply proved. Both know now that you can stand fire, and so does everybody else. You have touched my personal honour, sir, said Hornblower, bringing out one of his rehearsed speeches, and for that there can be only one remedy. Restrain yourself, please, Mr. Hornblower. Keane shifted himself in his chair with a wince of pain as he prepared to make a speech. I must remind you of one salutary regulation of the Navy, to the effect that no junior officer may challenge his senior to a duel. The reasons for it are obvious, otherwise promotion would be far too easy. The mere issue of issuing the challenge by a junior to a senior is a court-martial offence, Mr. Hornblower. Oh, said Mr. Hornblower feebly. Now here is some gratuitous advice, went on Keane. You have fought one duel and emerged with honour, that is good. Never fight another, that is better. Some people, oddly enough, acquire a taste for duelling, as a tiger acquires a taste for blood. They're never good officers, they're never popular ones either. It was then that Hornblower realised a great part of the keen excitement with which he had entered the captain's cabin was due to the anticipation of giving the challenge. It could be a morbid desire for danger, and a morbid desire to occupy momentarily the centre of the stage. Keane was waiting for him to speak, and it was hard to say anything. I understand, sir, he said at last. Keane shifted in his chair again. There is another matter I wanted to take up with you, Mr. Hornblower. Captain Pellew of the Indefatigable has room for another midshipman. Captain Pellew is partial to a game of whist, and has no good fourth on board. He and I have agreed to consider favourably your application for a transfer, should you care to make one. I don't have to point out that any ambitious young officer would jump at the chance of serving on a frigate. A frigate, said Hornblower. Everybody knew of Pellew's reputation and success. Distinction, promotion, prize money. An officer under Pellew's command could hope for all of these. And competition to be nominated for the Indefatigable must be intense, and this was the chance of a lifetime. Hornblower was then on the point of making a glad acceptance, when further considerations restrained him. That is very good of you, sir. I do not know how to thank you. But you accepted me as midshipman here, and of course I must stay with you. The drawn, apprehensive face relaxed into a smile. Not many men would have said that, said Keane. But I am going to insist on you accepting this offer. I shall not live very much longer to appreciate your loyalty, and this ship is not the place for you. This ship with her useless captain, don't interrupt me, and her worn-out first lieutenant and her old midshipman. You should be out there where there may be speedy opportunities of advancement. I have the good of the service in mind, Mr. Hornblower, when I suggest that you accept Captain Pellew's invitation. And it might be less disturbing for me if you did. Aye, aye, sir, said Hornblower.